greetings to you, our patriotic viewers. My name is Comrade Lonius Rosie, and I welcome you to yet another edition of the Special Call, a program where we discuss various pertinent issues affecting our societies and the nation at large. Today, our focus is on Africa Day. And joining us today is Dr. Davison Gomo, who is a decorated academic and also the Principal Director in the ZANU PF Commissariat Department. Comrade Gomo, I welcome you.
Oh, thank you. Good afternoon to you.
Afternoon, Doc.
Thank you.
Doctor, as an autochthon, or rather as one of the leading academics here in Zimbabwe, may you briefly explain what Africa Day entails?
Thank you. And I think it's very interesting that we should seek a discussion on Africa Day, a day after it, but perhaps more importantly, some of us feel that the day is slowly receding into not so much a very well-positioned significance, because more and more you don't see a lot of people being excited about it. This year's Africa Day, very subdued because obviously of the coronavirus pandemic. But this is a very special day to Africa and all Africans, if I may say, those living in the continent and those outside of it. It's significant in the sense that we are looking at the history of the African person. And I think what's important is to recognize that at some point in the development of humanity and the African people in general, there was a very sad episode when Africa was overrun and conquered and divided amongst Europeans, thus making Africa reduced into small little countries that were owned by Europeans to advance their social, economic, and political interest. But it does happen that at some point the Africans come to realize that that situation couldn't continue at all. Something had to happen. You know, when that happened, the process of decolonization started, leading to, I think you know that Ghana became the first African country to rid itself of colonialism. There was Liberia, as you know, which basically was a repository of all Africans who were repatriated from America. There was Ethiopia, which was never colonized, except, of course, the Italians tried, and they ended up staying on some corner of Ethiopia, which you now call Eritrea. But by and large, every part of Africa was subjugated by the Europeans. So that whole process created a number of serious challenges and problems for Africa. It meant that Africa and its citizens, in particular, were disempowered, disenfranchised, they were dehumanized, and the whole psychology of conquest is to make sure you deprive people of their dignity, you deprive them of a sense of self-worth, you destroy their culture, you destroy their sense of being in some way, because they become subjects. And that subjugation left Africa battered emotionally, culturally, economically, politically, and therefore the fight was necessary. So when in 1963, the few leaders and the few countries that were independent decided that it was important for them to create some kind of organization that takes seriously the process of decolonization, the process of total rejection of colonialism, as what happened. It was very, very important as a period that marks the beginning of Africa fighting back to make sure that we go back to where we were before colonization. And that day is very important because there will be no other day like that. And as you know, from that particular process, one by one and bit by bit, the African countries gained their independence, some through negotiations. But of course, if you think about these struggles in Zimbabwe, in Mozambique, in South Africa, in Angola, and so on, those were brutal struggles, absolutely brutal struggles. And they've remained very, very important in the back of the minds of the people that went through them, because in order to gain your political rights, you had to lose a lot of life unnecessarily. There was no need to fight white men. They needed just to accept that this was not their space, but they weren't prepared to give up so easily. It was necessary, and very necessary, that not only those, you remember the Mau Mau in Kenya, and so on, people had to fight, and therefore those who were directly involved had to be supported by other African countries that had gained independence before them. So it's a very, very long story, but one that defines our Africanity, if you like.
Yeah, perhaps one need to understand and know that what is really remarkable in celebrating, or rather commemorating, Africa Day.
It's extremely important because that's the beginning of, if I may put it this way, it's the beginning of the African person realizing exactly that they have become independent. They've suddenly become able to path their own political direction, their own economic development, their own social development, their own space actually in the global scheme of things, their own space in terms of restarting the whole process of building the industries and the culture that was devastated during colonialism. It was a process of learning anew, because the period, in some cases, if you take Zimbabwe, close to 100 years of domination. If you look at South Africa, just over 300 years of domination. So you're learning all over again how to become an African. Your values have been distorted. Your way of learning has been distorted. Your sense of looking at yourself has been distorted. The knowledge that you've acquired over many years is taught from a context that is totally un-African. So the whole reversal process, where you become responsible for reconstructing the whole ethos of being African, is very, very important. Because, unless you did that, you become an African with simply identified by simply your structure, the way you look, but otherwise you're as foreign as you can get. Because if your ideas about yourself are foreign, if your thought processes are foreign, if your own culture has become adulterated, if your sense of who you are is lost, you just can't say you're an African because you live in Africa. So that process of self-discovery is crucially important. And I think it is that drives the Africans to work very hard to re-establish themselves as a very, very important people in the world. If we don't do that, it then just means that the colonizer, the dominant class, which was basically made up of white people, is gone, but you're still the same. And this creates a lot of problems when it comes to, shall I say, defining your political direction, defining your development direction, defining your cultural revivalism, if you like, that sort of thing. It becomes extremely difficult. So it's important is to make sure that you come back to address and confront those demons, so you can be who you are, the same way the Indians, the Chinese, the English, the French, whoever are. It's very important. I know that Africa is not one country. Africa is very diverse in terms of culture, in terms of backgrounds, in terms of things that happened to us. Some were colonized by the English, some by the Portuguese, some by the Italians to a smaller extent, the French and so on. So the distortions that came with that They're still living with us today, and they're causing us a lot of problems. Because now we have a Portuguese African, we have an English African, we have a French African. Now, to come back and have one common universal ethos is very problematic. You have part of Africa that is made up of Mediterranean people, some are Arab and so on. So to bring them all together so that they can be one person is a gigantic task. This is why the formation of the Organization of African Unity there, which subsequently becomes the African Union, becomes extremely important, because you must define Africanity in such a way that all those that live in it accept and agree that whatever values we are projecting, whatever political direction we are taking, whatever development trajectory we are taking, is extremely important for positioning Africa in the greater global scheme of things in a way that results in the African people realizing their aspirations in all possible facets and dimensions of life.
Well, Doc, it's quite interesting really that the Revolutionary Party, the ZANU-PF, and the Organization for African Union or Unity, the OAU, were both formed in 1963. Could that be just some mere coincidence or accident, or it was really, when juxtaposing the two entities, you could deduce some whole lot of significance in all that?
There is some significance, and rightly so. Remember, at that point in time, the height of the fight against colonialism at that time was really very high. These people have started some of them actually in the early 1900s. They're starting that far back. The intensity is rising. And of course, as far as Zimbabwe is concerned, at that point in time, the politicians in this country decided completely and totally that the white man was never going to leave this country unless, of course, something very radical took place. I'm saying that the Organization of African Unity at that point in time is saying Africa can never be complete with some of our people still under subjugation. And it was strongest in some countries than others. In Kenya, it was very barbaric. In Zimbabwe, this was a settler economy. In South Africa, a settler economy. In Southwest Africa, Namibia now, a settler economy, and so on. So these guys weren't prepared just to give up. So when Zimbabweans decide that they're going to confront the settler by the most brutal means possible, this was very much in line with the thinking of the founding fathers, that something needs to happen to propel, to push forward the need to have all of Africa, every piece of land, every inch of land, free from foreign domination. So that the coincidence is very striking, and I believe at that time, I don't know if both of them weren't, but surely I believe that the former president was present at that meeting. He could have never been obviously at head of state level because we weren't free, but he had some presence there. And I think the input from a person who is coming from a country that is severely dominated in a destructive way was very important to inform some of the decisions that the OAU takes. Remember that up until that time, there hadn't been very, very, very brutal, rather a brutal confrontation, the way it happened in Mozambique, the way it happened in Zimbabwe, in Angola, in South Africa, and so on. Yes, there have been fights in some countries, but not to that extent. So when that happens, I think it puts the whole issue of fighting for the liberation of Africa at the right point. You recall that years down the line, after 1963, the countries surrounding Zimbabwe and a few others that were fighting here, they formed what they call the frontline states. The idea was that those that were nearest should form that organization in order to give the maximum support to those that were fighting. We needed the basis, we needed the ability to mobilize, of course, materials to support the war, the finances and so on. We couldn't do it from inside. We had to be in other countries. Of course, those that were free, and in 1975, 74, 75, Mozambique becoming free, the new frontier for the war and so on. So that's very, very important in the thinking prior that to ensure that that direction be supported, so that at the end of the day, we begin to see those that were dominant caving to the demands of the people. And I would say history that would require talking about at length, if we wish, because it was a very brutal history, particularly in those countries where the armed struggle was waged in order to break the bone, rather the backbone of the colonial system.
Oh, just to take you back a bit, you mentioned earlier on that the OAU played a significant role in bolstering revolutionary activities and ultimately ensuring that African states gained their independence. But today we hear, sentiments coming from mainly opposition political players, highlighting that the AU of today is now just more or less a toothless bulldog. What do you make of such sentiments?
It depends on the dog they are keeping in their backyard. The OAU must have kept a different dog, is it? So theirs have no teeth, but certainly I am sure that from what we've just said, the moral support, the logistical support that was given to all the liberation movements by the then OAU and subsequently, of course, AU was very important. Remember, they formed the Liberation Committee. They knew that was very, very important to do that. Yes, I can understand, because most of the political movements that you're talking about, these are movements that have come up long after Zimbabwe and other countries have become free. The freedoms they enjoy today, some people had to sacrifice their lives for. What we're seeing today, most of the opposition parties, with all due respect, their origins are not African in any way, because these are guys who are receiving a lot of ideas that are foreign by nature. And I don't think it's sufficient time, say today on this program, to go through all those phases. The international capitalist system, the international imperialist system, the way it set itself up, it was fighting from all angles. If you can create parties that are a reflection of their interest and get them to fight against well-established, genuine, deep-rooted African influence movements, those that knew exactly it was important to overthrow these systems and build a system that reflected the African historical, cultural experiences, and in some cases, the military experiences arising from the armed struggle. You see what I mean? Redefining themselves so that the people became the core, the people became the primary reason why you operate as a political party. Remember that up to that point when we overthrow the colonial system, it's 1/2 of the struggle. After that, you are focusing on very serious issues of development. How do you reconfigure your education so that it speaks to your own needs, your health system, your public infrastructure, your industry, and so on? It's one thing to continue with the agenda of the Western world, and another to create systems and institutions that speak to your actual needs as a people. I mean, today I can argue with you that I still am very skeptical about whether we've been able to actually orient our entrepreneurial development programs so they actually reflect exactly what we want as African people. to the extent that most of these institutions that we carried over strengthened. It is unfortunate because we really want to set up institutions that can address issues of the ordinary person so that they prop up development that is genuinely focused on the needs of all these ordinary people. I'll tell you why that is important. Because down the line, as long as you have a lot of people that are marginalized and they are excluded from a wealth creation process, or they become part of a wealth creating system, but with that wealth slipping through their fingers, we're never going to have political stability until people feel that they're not only part of the wealth creation process, but they own that wealth. They can address a lot of their social and economic challenges from the efforts they put into that process. So it's all this here that most of the political groupings that you're talking about don't understand. They are protecting the privilege of those that were there. But no, the land question is a good example. They tell us, oh no, when you took land, what did you do? But this is a long development process. It just doesn't happen overnight. You make mistakes and correct them. I'm better off making mistakes and correcting them than surrender my entitlement to that person purely because they say, what are you doing with what we gave you? They didn't give us, by the way. We fought in order to repossess what we now own. We need to defend that vigorously and throughout. But what it means is we need to create systems that slowly assimilate our people into the processes of wealth creation so we can fight the scourge of poverty and stop the possibility of political fragility creeping in, because that's the easiest route to get into our system and thwart every developmental effort we are trying as Africans.
Doc, we're having this discussion at a time when AU's 2020 running theme is silencing the guns and creating conducive conditions for Africa's development. So what exactly is your assessment of this subject matter regarding to the achievement of perpetual peace, unity and development of Africa?
It goes exactly to the issues I was talking about. Your biggest enemy is marginalization, poverty, people feeling helpless, people lacking access to opportunities and resources, people owning a country but not owning the resources, people owning a country but not owning the agenda of development, people owning a country that for all practical purposes they don't belong to because they're not part and parcel of what's going on. All that can be deliberate. And what we're saying is, if all the African countries come together and defined in a very clear way, look at Africa, what is it that you don't have? You have rivers, you have minerals, you've got very good soils, massive land at your disposal, massive human skills, minus those, of course, who are miseducated, and just about look left, right, and center, north, south, east, and west. There's just about everything that the world needs is in Africa. Everything that Africa does not need is not here. We need everything, but what happens is that Africans are busy chasing things that they don't need and they don't have. They don't worry too much about what they have. If we focused on that, and we had leadership that obviously take us through very slowly and carefully, and we are prepared to make that small little sacrifice so that we establish our own industries that make our own shoes, our own clothes, our own food, our own everything that we want. Make it here, sell those things amongst ourselves as Africans. Of course, I'm not naive as to believe that there's virtually nothing that we want from other countries. We want that. But I think with over 1 billion people, Africa is a huge market already. Whatever we are buying from outside, we can buy from within. We supplement that with what we don't have. There will be areas of technology where we suffer a deficit, sure. But all these universities should be structured in such a way they begin to claw back, and so on. So we build a local fund of skill and knowledge that is applied to programs and activities that are typically located within Africa for the African markets, and so on. So what do? We need to open up our space a little bit as Africans. If we don't do that, look at the places where the guns are making a lot of noise. You have your cobalt, your coltan, your diamonds, your whatever. Why are they fighting? They're fighting because somebody in this country is taking those diamonds, or the cobalt, or whatever it is, or the platinum, and so on. When you allow the exploitation of your resources in ways and structures that leave your people stranded, the guns will not be silenced. Because people are looking for wherewithal. And what I'm saying is, Africa is sufficient. We have oil, don't we? We have gas, don't we? We have all those things. It is time for Africa to sit back and think very carefully about how to partner with people that come here. I don't believe that they should come and dominate. Some kind of partnership that ensures that our people, when that partnership expires, our people have the knowledge, have the skill, have the means, have the ownership of things that matter to them, and their lives are changing in a very significant way. Now look at it this way. Since Africa came into being, we have not been able to domesticate the automobile manufacture. Is there any reason why Africa shouldn't obviously manufacture its own vehicles? How much money is leaving Africa in search of vehicles outside? There are so many things, and there's clear evidence that countries that have decided by policy and followed it through. Dubai is a good example. This was nothing less than 40 years ago. But they decided, this is what we have, this is what we want to do. And they went through. South Korea did the same, Malaysia did the same, Singapore did the same. So my view is that Africa needs to sit back and not pursue things that are very, very easy to get. You want to buy a t-shirt from China? You want to buy shoes from China? You want to buy all these things? Even your milk and so on? Is there any reason why we can't have a sophisticated daily system that supplies sufficient milk to Africa? Why do we export such things? We can't. Beef is out of reach for ordinary people. These are things that so Africa needs to think very seriously and make sure they deliver on the table there, on the dinner table, things that matter to the African person. The school, education must not be too expensive and unaffordable. Your health system, we see what government in Zimbabwe is doing at the moment. Wonderful stuff. Recovering all the problems, you see what I mean, in terms of infrastructure deficits and so on. We see government doing that. We've seen government doing roads in this country. We've seen government doing dams and so on. That's part of laying the foundation that is very important to ensure that you fight hunger and poverty ruthlessly. And if you succeed in that regard, people will put away the guns. When people have no water, when you can't collect a liter from the streets, when people have no electricity, they can't afford school fees, they can't afford medical bills, how do the guns stop? They won't. So there's a huge need for commitment to massive development, and I'm talking about internally driven development to Africa. Over-reliance on foreigners is never going to solve our problems. We have enough means. We have enough intellectual wherewithal and capacity now. We have the political will. I think that the African countries must not be victims of their own past. It's something that's very difficult to walk away from, but they need to learn that there's some form of sacrifice that's required to take Africa to another level. Development, development, development is the way to go. If we're going to silence our the guns that you're talking about. Peace, people can't be at peace when they're hungry. People cannot be at peace when they are not united. When people are hungry, they are very easy to divide, and therefore disunity comes in. Because people are just looking for something to live by each day. You see that at very local level. And I think this is the massive task that the leaders of the African Union today, if we want to celebrate a very successful Africa Day, we can do so when our people have suddenly found that the space that they occupy economically does offer them real opportunities to sustainable livelihoods.
Well, Doc, still on the sufficiency of Africa, it's largely known that Africa is a net exporter of raw materials as well as human capital. But in spite of all that, a lot of demeaning and, should I say, derogatory sentiments have been peddled about Africa, such that even in literature circles, books have been written. You know, for instance, I will give you an example of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, you know, where he describes Africa as the heart of primitiveness and brutality and all sorts of, you know, of banditry. Now, having that in mind, what exactly do you make of Africa regarding to its importance in the global setup?
This is why Africa must move away from building relationships with systems that are anti-African. And this is why Africans must begin to take the responsibility to define who they are. Because everything that you're talking about right now, these are definitions by people from outside who obviously would want to see Africa from the experience of what has been going on for years and years. Remember the experiences of the slaves. How were they treated? Remember people working under a colonial system. How were they treated? These are the images. Actually, even in post-independent Africa, the bulk of this story is told by French 24, BBC World, CNN, and Al Jazeera, and so on. They pick up those stories that I think are important to them and are good stuff to the ears of those that hear them in their own space. And it's important to keep Africa that way because Africa has what they want. The more you're presented to the world as hopeless, I mean, if you say what's an African today, you're thinking of an African as an asylum seeker, is it? You're thinking of an African as a beggar. You're thinking of an African as somebody who really can't save themselves. They need someone else. And what I'm saying, the whole concept of aid, these countries coming to us and saying, we're going to give you some aid to deal with A, B, C, D, and so on. The whole scenario of the NGOs and so on. I think all these things are carefully managed to ensure that Africa stays where it should be, a primitive place. I am saying to you, it is up to the political leadership in Africa to confront that terrible image and change it around, and it's very possible. This can be done because, yes, your young boys and girls will go elsewhere looking for jobs because there's no capacity. There's no capacity. What I like, maybe at this point, you remember what President Mnangagwa has been talking about. Production, production, production. You're never going to make it unless all your economic facets are in place and they're functioning well. In other words, let's sit back and say, who is going to make our cooking oil? Who is going to make our margarine, our milk, our bread, our shoes, our shirts, our trousers, our jackets, our computers, our whatever? We should be saying that. Yeah, for those things that we have no capacity just yet. But from the activities that we are undertaking and exporting, I would prefer a situation where we export to Africa, because Africa is buying a lot of things from outside, is it? Look at Nigeria's import bill, look at Kenya's import bill, look at Uganda's import bill, South African import bill, look at where they are importing those things. If we develop internal capacity as Africa, if Africa industrializes sensibly and sustainably, most of these things are spent well within Africa. It reduces our dependence on China, on Europe, on America, and our relationship transforms, because now we don't need them as much as we do right now. If we reduce our dependence on those, it just means that the respect that's accorded to Africa rises, and that is what is important. And I actually believe that if we stop wrangling about things that are peripheral to critical things and focus on those things that really change the dynamics in terms of business, the economy, and so on, and emphasize on the right things, Africa will be on a course to recovery. Somebody said exactly what you said, all those things, the terrible images that are painted about Africa. Somebody says, no, all those terrible things are not actually disadvantage. You need to turn them, flip them around, and Africa is a land of opportunity. But give those opportunities to the citizens of Africa, support those people to do what they have to do. I don't think we should be condemned as people of Africa. We should not be condemned to informal activities. No. You will never eradicate informal activities, but those should not be the ones that define our economy. We want to be as formal as you can get. The capabilities are there. What is going wrong? Those are the things that Africa needs to confront very honestly. There's also something that I believe is a bit false and needs to be sorted out. There's no need for us to say we are in SADC, we are in COMESA, and still impose restrictions that prevent business from taking place across the borders. People can move freely across the borders. You go into Zambia, they will say you are here for 30 days. Why should I be for 30 days when I want to be there for 50 days? I'm in Africa, we are saying we're working together. Why don't we simply relax a lot of those things so that there is free movement? I'll tell you what, one of the biggest things in order to reverse that we need to do, let's fix our roads that connect the whole continent. Let's fix our rails that connects the whole continent. Let's fix our air transport systems that connect the whole world. Let's fix our waterways so that people have huge opportunities of getting from one point to the other. At the moment, there's some countries that have very bad roads where they are, and there are some countries that have no roads at all. And most of the ambitions that we have, and most of the things that we want to push for, in the absence of good roads, the good rail systems, good air transport, and waterways, and so on, that might obviously remain a very huge hindrance to what we want to do as Africa. So the whole question of infrastructure development, while focused on country-by-country basis, there's need to look at it in continental terms, so we can improve the mobility of people, of goods, of services in Africa, so we can compete with the rest of the world. And I think that is very important. Let me just say this before I exit from the question that you asked. Everyone, I don't know who said this, but I agree with them. Everyone has a strategy for Africa. The Chinese have a strategy for Africa. The Indians have a strategy for Africa. The Europeans have a strategy for Africa. The Japanese, the Russians, everyone has a strategy for Africa. Africa has no strategy for anyone, let alone even for themselves. Yes, there's the free continental trade area, or the continental free trade area as it is called now, but we want to see that that can now begin to work in a meaningful and practical way in order to drive business in Africa and so on. Our education system is very important. There's got to be a lot of interlinkages between universities in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Uganda, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, that exchange of knowledge that is focused on the concrete realities of Africa. When we produce a lot of knowledge that does not relate here, That's why it's very easy for your boys and girls to go elsewhere, because they've been trained so that they fit very well into an American system, into an Australian system, except in Africa. That must just change. And that transformation is important to make sure that Africa begins to play its part and its role in self-development.
Well, though, coming to the African Union, I mean, the continental bloc is totally against sanctions, illegal sanctions rather, imposed on the nation of Zimbabwe, a position that has also been taken by SADC, which even went to the extent of declaring the 25th of October as an anti-sanctions day. What are your sentiments on that?
I think it's very important that Africa speaks against any form of interference into its domestic affairs. Sanctions are evil, are unacceptable, a brutal means of maintaining international relations or dealing with problems between countries. Totally unacceptable. What I practically detest is that the very clear mechanism that's established for resolving such conflicts. But the America, in particular, the European Union, and to a lesser extent the countries that support them, they use their economic and military dominance to impose their will on others. The sanctions on Zimbabwe have never been acceptable. They never went through any established due process, no recognized channels of dealing with the problems that obviously are said to exist. For Zimbabwe, we never had any problem with anybody. We repossessed our land strictly because that's what we fought for. You can go on and look at a few countries right now that are on sanctions. You can see that the motive is very selfish. But to the extent that the African Union, the SADC community, and maybe a few others as well, organized communities in Africa, are fighting against sanctions, that in itself is very, very important to the African agenda, because the more you have disruptions that arise because of unilateral actions by a world power or a group of countries that constitutes a massive political and economic power, doesn't matter what they say, it's totally unacceptable. So I'm totally in agreement with the AU, with SADC, fighting to have sanctions removed from Zimbabwe. Because you know what? If these sanctions were removed and Zimbabwe began to trade with everyone on even keel, some of the problems that we see, some of the problems that are bedeviling our development will disappear overnight. This country has the capacity to play a very important, in the absence of sanctions, Zimbabwe can play a very important role in influencing what happens in its neighborhood. The capacity is there, everyone knows that. We've done a lot of things in the past, we still can do that, but this is being disrupted by this very unwarranted illegal action by America in particular, and to a lesser extent by the Europeans, of course in support of the British. The conditions have changed, there's no longer any need for that. And I think obviously the coronavirus pandemic has made it even worse. There's no longer any need for that. The world economy has been battered very seriously. Every country needs to rethink its strategy about how we go forward. Now when you put all these stumbling blocks, you make it worse for some countries to develop. And I don't think that is necessary. We need to start on a new and clean slate going forward. And the best way to do that is by removing not just sanctions and all these conditionalities that are imposed on weaker and smaller countries so they change their behavior in favor of the person who is punishing them. That's not necessary. And I think that Zimbabweans in their thousands or millions must support the push for the sanctions to be removed instead of actually agitating for the retention of these sanctions. You know very well that there are people who have made it their business to campaign for the retention of sanctions. And they're saying, Is this in the interest of the country? The answer is no. It's never in the interest of the country. So why are they doing it? You go back to the post-independent opposition movement. These were always sponsored by powerful nations. In this case, most of them would have a common father. You know what I mean? Because they are thinking in Kenya, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, whatever, it's the same. It is just the same. And they demonize their own people and so on. How many times has President Mnangagwa been called names and so on? And you say to yourself, is there substance in all this? Sure, there's no substance. It's all froth. But it's very disruptive. What's interesting is that in this country, the president has opened up the space for everyone to play their role the way they want. He has even created a dialogue platform that if you've got a problem, I won the election, you did not. So let me listen to you. What is your problem? What do you want? Let's talk. But you see, they are unwilling to talk because they are part of the old-fashioned regime change agenda. There is no person in Zimbabwe or in any other African country who is going to participate in changing a government purely because somebody who is sitting in some capital somewhere says it should happen. That era is gone. I think that President Mnangagwa will stand or fall on the basis of his policies. We support him because we think he's a progressive thinker, he's a very honest guy, he works hard, he tries by all means to make sure that even if the differences were there, let's work together. So this opposition movement is not just in Zimbabwe, and you know they work together. The ones in Kenya, the ones in Nigeria, the ones in Uganda, the ones in, if you look at Vachamisa's friends, they are all those that are in opposition everywhere. And you wonder why there's commonality in their whole agenda of opposition. What I'm saying is that they are from the same father. Africa is better off supporting all political movements that have succeeded on the basis of a genuine fight against colonialism, all political movements whose primary agenda is development that is African-focused, that is people-focused, that seeks to strengthen Africa, and obviously eventually get Africa to a point where it becomes a recognized economic influence in the world. And I think that is possible, even judging by the few things that are happening now. Don't forget, a lot of things have changed in Africa. Leaders, the first generation of African leaders are gone. And therefore the thinking, the focus and so on is totally different today. In Botswana there's a new leader, in Zimbabwe there's a new leader, in South Africa there's a new leader, in Madagascar there's a new leader, in Kenya all these people have a totally different disposition towards how you manage your national and state affairs. They are willing to engage. They are willing to involve everyone in defining exactly where we are going. You've seen it in this country.
Yes.
When the president is trying to bring everyone on board, what's your problem? If you're nurses, if you're teachers, if you're what, let's talk. But because they come from the old school, that school of confrontation for the sake of it, they also don't quite realize that if you don't put a lot of effort into work, there's no money that's going to come from people who don't work. We need our industries to tick. We need our commerce to tick. We need our services to tick. When that happens, our country begins to take off. Yes, it will minimize the number of people that go far away in search of it, but you could never, the diaspora is as old as creation itself. You can't stop it, but obviously you can reduce it on a massive scale.
Oh, speaking of new leaders, coming closer to home, the President, His Excellency Comrade Edin Mnangagwa, being a revolutionary leader, but a new leader in this new dispensation, is globally acknowledged and recognized, as one of those remaining giant African statesmen. One who rather fits in the shoes left by the likes of Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and even Nelson Mandela. What do you make of that?
It's very easy. He's got a very strong personality. He's got very strong beliefs about what Africa should be. He's committed to opening the political space to as many people as would want to participate. He's actually saying, listen, our salvation lies in one thing and one thing only. Let us work to make sure that our economies take off. Let's concentrate all our efforts in getting the economy right. Every other problem takes second place. And I think that is where it's important. Remember, I was just saying, the focus on Africa today should be development. What a better person to exemplify it than Dr. Mnangagwa. He's been talking, we've heard him on radio, on television, on public spaces, and so on. He's, to a point, obviously, he repeats himself so many times as something risking boring people. He does so because it's important for a country to understand that if it does not work in order to change its economic fortunes, there is no salvation that's going to come from somewhere else except from your own hands, except from the application of your own thoughts and processes to work and produce things that you use yourselves, things that you eat, and so on, instead of depending on things that are produced elsewhere. And you know, they're subject to a lot of serious global vicissitudes, if I may use that term. The truth is that it can be better than that. This president is unique in one way. He understands the subterranean world. In other words, the world of intelligence. He's well schooled in that. He understands the military world. He understands the political world. He understands the economic world. And most importantly, he understands the need to create and expand the democratic space. So when you put all these things together, here is one person who can make a difference. Because he does not need education on all those things. He understands them well. And I think what makes him very unique, he says all these things in a very calm, easy to understand manner, and is also approachable. What more do you want? If you've got a visionary like that, people have been asking for democracy everywhere. He's granting you that democracy. People are asking for development. He's granting you an opportunity to develop. People are asking for participation in political decision making. He's actually saying, look, come on the top table. Let's talk about it. How do you want it? How do you want it done? If you're talking about youth, he's actually creating space for the young people, for the women. He's creating space for the young, for the women, and so on. What more do you want from a president? There are less people who have been sent to prison under this man than at any other time in the history of this country, and maybe a few other countries. To the whole world, he's saying, come on, Zimbabwe is willing to work with every country that wants to work with it. Zimbabwe does not want to create enemies. It wants to create partners. He's actually said, to the risk of losing the support of other people, that if you've got a business idea and you want to come and practice it here, you want to come and invest in this country, come and do that. Where on earth do you get a leader like that? And of course, I think he's a great guy who needs to be supported, initially by his own people and then the rest of the world. And initially people took him for granted because this was political grandstanding. But with time, people have come to realize this is a very serious man who is committed to that. And right now he's saying to you, brother, you and me, hey, you guys, jump onto my train. Let's move together. Let's make sure that when we get to 2030, we have a very clear system that exists in Zimbabwe. And we can share that with everyone else in the world. So I actually think you can't get a president who practically puts his cards on the table and say, there you are, this is all I am looking for. If there's anything, yeah, let's differ on other things, but let's not differ on development, on economic growth, and so on. That's what he's doing.
You highlighted that the president understands the political terrain. He also understands the military and intelligence terrain. But right now, he's more of a, an outstanding captain regarding to the fight against coronavirus, which is more or less a medical field. How best can you describe, the person?
It's not a medical field in any way. It's a public policy terrain. It's understanding exactly that when people are visited by a devastating pandemic like that, what do you do in terms of public policy? How do you put together systems and institutions that fight it? And that's what he's going to do. Reorganizing things so that you fight it. Making sure you place on priority those things that are important. That's what he's going to do. Remember when he started, a lot of people actually were skeptical, but he was so determined because he was very clear that this is how we want to fight this thing. The model might have been universal, but the application very different. The level of commitment very different, and so on. He's been able to lead the nation and galvanize the support of every area of public life, every facet of it. He's been able to do that. Now look at the amount of business enterprises that are coming forward to assist. It's because they see an amount of oozing goodwill from the man, that he means it, he's serious. And after all, what is the use of a leader if that leader is not going to prioritize the life of his own people? Yes, you've got people that are now saying, oh, this lockdown, this and so on. But quite frankly, the truth is that we are not out of the woods yet. And look at him when he's speaking. He's very sober, he's very clear. He's really saying to you, this is nothing personal. We want to make sure that our country is safe. We want to make sure that we don't indulge in a behavior that is harmful to the other person. So let's enforce that and protect the wider population. It can be better than that. So yeah, I understand your attempt in positioning that as a medical thing. I don't think so. He's creating a space where those with very critical skills in medicine can function very effectively and feel supported. The hospitals are being reorganized. The hospitals are being refurbished. Centers that are required to make sure that people are tested, the isolations, you've seen that. Well within what Zimbabwe can afford. And in some cases, we've been assisted by others. But whatever assistance we've got, it's gone to good use in order to ensure that you and I are not endangered by this terrible virus. So I see there a clear understanding of public policy and its application in the most dynamic and responsible fashion in order to ensure that this country is safe from the devastating effects of COVID-19.
Yeah, well, still on COVID-19, with an African state, Madagascar, it proposed, or rather laid a cure, should I say, a COVID-19 cure, but it has not really been accepted world over, mainly because people have certain, ways of treating an African product or something that is being proposed by an African state. What do you mean of it?
A very interesting scenario indeed, but I can tell you that from a marketing point of view, any product very often is affected by what's called the country of origin effect. Now, even you do it in this country. If I say to you my shoes were made by somebody at Siaso in Bara, you look down upon them, is it? Because of the place where they were made. I'll say, no, I will never buy a shoe from somebody who does shoes from a corner shop and so on. They may make the best shoes, but you're not giving them a chance to demonstrate to you that this is, after all, a very good shoe. That is very common human, a very common human approach to things. There's residual prejudice against the African countries. I want to say, however, because of the magnitude of this problem, indeed, we may have the shrubs that can respond and deal with this thing very effectively. But because the whole world was changed so as to accept the methods of the Eurocentric approach to medicines, to pharmacology, if you like, and so on. The local indigenous knowledge, experiences, were expunged out of the window because those were considered primitive and untested and so on. The herbs that a lot of people use to treat the ailments that face human beings, they probably have an origin in Africa. Those guys probably even stole some intellectual property, some knowledge that our parents, up to this day, we still have people with very, very good knowledge of how certain shrubs work. That knowledge has been stolen, it's processed and packaged and brought back to us. I don't want to rule out what's happening in Madagascar because I don't have sufficient evidence to prove that there are people who have used it and the conditions of COVID-19 has reversed. I equally don't want to discount that whatever they are doing in Madagascar is effective. I don't want to do that until there was a test of some kind. They haven't done so. Where I have a problem with them, they are condemning Madagascar before obviously attempting to test whether what they are claiming is true. You can only condemn when you have proven very clearly beyond any reasonable doubt that the medicine that's being prescribed is a placebo. In this case, we don't know. The guys actually say it works. So there should be an independent process of making sure, give them time to make sure that you test and confirm that their shrubs or their medicine, whatever they're using, is working. But what you are seeing now is a typical condescending European attitude towards Africa, that there's nothing good that can come out of Africa. And I think, if you ask me at personal level, even without conclusive evidence, I'm likely to support Madagascar on its claims and only dismiss them when there's complete evidence to suggest it doesn't work. But I couldn't just accept the condemnation of a discovery by somebody in the absence of a clear assessment of whether what they are claiming is true or not. It's going to be subjected to that. So I would stay with Madagascar on that point.
Yeah, well, still on COVID-19 issue, the Chinese government, Chinese philanthropists, and even the Chinese corporate world, they've been so influential, in assisting various African states in the fight against COVID-19. What do you make of the Chinese relations with African states?
When we were fighting back then, when we wanted assistance to fight the settler regime here, America was there, Britain was there, Europe was there. It was China that gave us sanctuary. It was China that supported what we were doing. You see what I'm talking about? When we were under siege at the United Nations, and these guys wanted to impose sanctions on it, it was China that stood very firm against the imposition of sanctions on Zimbabwe. There are numerous occasions when China has stood shoulder to shoulder with the African countries. They've built some dams. Those that complain have no dam. They have no intention to build one. They have no aid towards that, but they condemn. And the narrative that they've planted amongst African countries is that you are being colonized by China. Quite frankly, would the president sell us to China like a product? I don't believe so. Because if he does that, he digs his own grave. Countries are built on carefully structured relationships. We've had an emotional, economic, political, structural relationship with China, as Zimbabwe, as many other countries in Africa. China has put a lot of its money on a number of things. It's not everything that is perfect sometimes. If you look at this relationship at different levels, Jack Ma is an individual who is absolutely rich. He knows he makes his money from communities, including Africans who buy from his system. He knows that. The money that is made is not made on his own. He's supported by ordinary people who buy most of the stuff that he makes. So when the world is under siege, you go back and assist those people because it's they that partner you to make the wealth that you have. He's a philanthropist. A philanthropist is not created by law. This is somebody who knows I've got a lot of money that I've made by working with these people. They are my customers. I couldn't succeed without them. Now they are in trouble. Let me plow back and stabilize the world. I don't see anything wrong with that. If the Chinese corporates did the same, but I mean, if they come here, you give them concessions to do gold, to do diamonds, to do whatever, timber and so on, how do they repay you back? Corporate social responsibility. There is a potential danger to destabilize markets. Some of those actions are actually a reflection of a lot of self-interest. Because if you have your customer base decimated, how are you going to continue as a business? We have a very meaningful, productive relationship with China as Africa that has spanned many years and at different historical epochs and so on. So, this is why many people say that China is an all-weather friend. When the Europeans came here, when the British were here, the Chinese have not taken away your land. They negotiate to work with you. The British took our land. What have they given us back in return? Nothing, to be honest. Everything they are doing advances their own interest. The Commonwealth is all about making sure they open space and avenues for their own businesses. That sort of thing. They will always have small change that comes through overseas aid. Small change. So, because you've never been used, somebody who comes in and puts in a lot of effort in a very, very massive way, you then become suspicious. What do they want? But look at the relationship over a long period of time. It's always been reciprocal, quid pro quo, not one-sided. So I think that I would rather, obviously, deal with a clever enemy than a stupid friend.
Doc, as we wrap up, how best can the next generations, extol the values of Pan-Africanism as well as safeguarding the legacy embedded in Africanity?
It's a very huge challenge for African leadership to do that because of globalization, because of the distortions that have come as a result of the advances in information technology and so on. And for me, I think that the political systems, governments and political parties, if you like, your universities, your polytechnics, your higher education, your primary education, kids need to be taught when they're still very young what it is that constitutes an African. How do we interrelate as a huge continent with a diversity of cultures, a diversity of people, a diversity of beliefs, and so on. I don't think that we should be frightened by the diversity of our cultures and our beliefs. One thing that should obviously unite us is to have a very common ideological position that defines how we relate to the rest of the people in the world. When we have not done that, we've been at our weakest and we've been attacked left and right and center, even by the smallest of countries in the world. So I think that there must be a systematic approach, very sustainably, that begins to teach children of Africa, in Africa, about how Africa conflicts, how Africa obviously kind of like blends together. How is a Nigerian similar or dissimilar to me? I shouldn't worry about what they eat because I eat something that's different. I shouldn't worry about how they dress because obviously how I dress is very specific to my own environment. What should unite us is that big concept of Africanity. We are Africans. What is it that unites us? What is it that keeps us a solid group? Why is that important? Because if we remain fragmented, if we emphasize our differences, we will, to some extent, I think, extend on what the colonialists did. We're broken into small little countries and made to believe that the person next door is not your friend. Look at the people in this country. If you go to Chipinga, you've got people from Mozambique who are practically the same people as those on the other side of Zimbabwe. If you're in Malawi, and you're on the border with Mozambique, what separates these people is just a road. The people on that side and that side are the same. And so we can go on and on. So we want to find that very strong common ideological position that keeps Africa together, because when we do that, it's the more and more we are able to defend our resources, defend our heritage, and defend our cultures, defend our own identity as a people. I think what you're asking is very important, because I don't want to believe that we're going to end up with people who live in Africa and they're not Africans. They are black, but they're not Africans. They speak the language, but they're not Africans. The opportunity for that to entrench is very high if we don't incorporate the teaching of African history, African heritage, just the concept of Africanity to our people. Because if we don't do that, they aspire to be American, they aspire to be British, they aspire to be something else, and Africa will be a deserted land. End of day, our situation will become poorer and poorer, and there's no African left. Even if you meet African people, but they're still not Africans.
Quite insightful. Doc, it's very unfortunate that because of time we cannot be allowed to continue with this discussion. But from myself and the crew behind the scenes, would you please, or may you please accept our sincere gratitude, for this insightful and enlightening discourse. Thank you very much, Doc.
Thank you. It was nice talking to you as well. Good.
Or to you, our patriotic viewers, you heard it yourself from this revolutionary, academic, and Pan-African think tank that everyone is a strategy for Africa. Americans have a strategy for Africa. The British have a strategy for Africa. But it's now time that Africa develops her own strategy, her own, roadmap. So from the crew behind the scenes, the producers of this program, and myself, Comrade Rosie, we say Happy Africa Day and goodbye for now.